Have you taken birding vacations in the hope of seeing certain species? Or perhaps you've been on more general vacations and gone birding while there. While some of us may take vacations with the sole purpose of birding, at other times we may be away with loved ones or travelling companions who don't share our passions, and our time away with them is precious. However, we still want to see the birds that we may not see back home. Well, it is possible to incorporate birding with regular activities, and, if lucky, we can arrange for a day of pure birding while there. This week, we hear from Kate Shaw from the Strange Animals podcast, who did just that during a recent vacation in Belize. Welcome to the Casual Birder podcast. I'm Suzy Buttress. As a casual birder, I take pleasure in watching the wild birds around me, wherever I am. In my show, I share the joy of birding. I tell you about the birds I've seen, speak with experts and enthusiasts, go on bird outings, and I share stories from birders around the world. Last episode, I shared my birding plans for the year ahead and spoke about the visits that I've already made to my local reserves this year. Do take a listen. Birding in a new location, whether it's a different region of your own country or another country a long way from home, is so exciting. But if we're not on a pure birding trip, how can we enjoy our birding passion while still giving attention to our companions? If you're anything like me, people in your life already know that birds will distract you. It's not unknown for me to gaze around if I've heard a bird while outdoors and maybe excuse myself from the conversation while I find it. But that will be short-lived, and I always return to the conversation. Depending on the type of trip, setting your own expectations before you go and discussing the options with your companions can help accommodate everyone's desires. Perhaps it will mean getting up early and doing some solo birding before breakfast, or acknowledging that the only birds you'll see will be those in your immediate vicinity while at the beach or sightseeing. If there's a nearby nature reserve, that can be a great way for everyone to enjoy a stroll, and perhaps you can introduce your companions, especially children, to the local wildlife. Birding is such a versatile hobby, and it can be matched to your mood or opportunities, making it ideal to do anywhere. I was delighted when Kate Shaw of the Strange Animals podcast contacted me to tell me about the birds she'd seen on a recent trip to Belize. I was unfamiliar with the birds found there, and as I learned more from her about what she saw, I invited her to tell us about the trip in her own words.
Hi, this is Kate Shaw from Strange Animals podcast. In mid-December 2021, I visited Belize for a week. My brother and his family had booked a villa last spring when the vaccine was rolling out, and everyone was full of hope that things were returning to normal. Ha 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 ha. My brother invited me and one of my cousins to join them since they had 2 extra beds. By early December, though, I was certain the trip would have to be postponed, but it wasn't. So, with a negative COVID test and my vaccination card in one hand and my binoculars in the other, I'm exaggerating, they were in my bag, I flew from my home in the southeastern United States to Belize, which is in Central America. Because I'd been so sure the trip wasn't going to happen, and because I'd been so busy leading up to December, I hadn't studied the birds of Belize at all. All I'd done is buy a copy of a field guide to the birds of Mexico and adjacent areas. I hadn't even had time to bird very much at home. It wasn't until I was actually in Belize, with palm trees all around, that I realized what an amazing opportunity this was for birding. Our villa was right on the beach, with a big balcony overlooking the ocean. We got in fairly late and went to dinner at a little restaurant down the street. By then it was nearly dark, and while I saw a few birds, I couldn't identify them in the gloom. We ate locally caught fish on the restaurant's veranda, and I sipped the best pina colada I'd ever had. And when the power suddenly went out all up and down the street, and we had to finish our meal by candlelight, I felt a deep, peaceful joy that, despite everything, I was lucky enough to be experiencing this perfect moment. The next morning I wanted to sleep in a bit, but the sound of birds outside my window dragged me out of bed at dawn. I went out on the balcony and tried to identify the seabirds gliding overhead, the raucous birds that had woken me, but which were apparently invisible, and a pair of doves perched in the nearby coconut palm. I identified some brown pelicans and was confused that I kept seeing birds I knew had to be turkey vultures. Turkey vultures are common throughout most of the Americas, and I can identify them at a glance, but I didn't know they ever lived along the coast. These turkey vultures were sailing alongside gulls and terns. I even saw what I thought were black vultures, also common at home, but seemingly out of place at the beach. The brown pelican was a lifer for me, but soon after I identified my next lifer, the birds that had woken me. Once I got a good look at one, it was obviously a type of grackle, and a quick check of my guidebook helped me identify it as a great-tailed grackle. It turns out that they're incredibly common, at least in our little part of Belize, and we saw them all the time. I also identified the doves as white-winged doves, another lifer. When I announced this to my family, my brother, sister-in-law, and cousin all started singing the Stevie Nicks song, of course. My 3 nephews thought we'd lost our minds. Later that day, we walked to the nearest town, about a mile away. My cousin Molly came with us and brought her binoculars too, so we could both do a bit of birding. Molly isn't really a birder, but her mother, my Aunt Janice, is my birding buddy. Janice had loaned Molly her second-best binoculars, with instructions to do some actual birding. That turned into a running gag all week. They weren't binoculars, they were only ever your mom's second-best binoculars. It was the kind of hot, flat afternoon you only really get near the ocean when you're not actually on the beach. Even so, there were a lot of birds around. I identified more great-tailed grackles, turkey vultures, white-winged doves, and a black vulture, but I was stumped by everything else. At home, I'm a pretty good birder, but in Belize, I was hopeless. I sketched the birds I saw and noted down field marks in hopes of identifying them later, when I had time to look through my guidebook. I did so later and positively ID'd a great crested flycatcher, but the others remained a frustrating mystery. There was one bird I kept seeing along the coast, and which was driving me bananas because it was so distinctive, but I couldn't identify it. It was enormous, with long, sharp wings with a distinctive crook, and a long, thin, sharp tail. It was black or dark brown, but some I saw had a white bib. They would glide above the edge of the water so effortlessly, they seemed barely to move. I was positive I was looking at some kind of kite, but I just couldn't tell. It wasn't until I got a really good look at one's head and saw the distinctive slender hook-tipped bill that I finally identified it as a magnificent frigate bird. I announced it to the whole family in triumph, and my middle nephew thought I said something else. A frigate is a type of ship, if you were wondering. The magnificent frigate bird has a 7.5-foot wingspan, or 2.25 meters, and the females have the white bib, while males have a red throat sac that's not very noticeable in winter. He inflates the sac during the breeding season, which makes him a whole lot easier to identify. The next morning, we had our big excursion, a wildlife tour down the Monkey River in a boat. I'd imagined it as a few hours drifting along on a slow-moving, muddy river, and wore a summery black and white dress with running shoes to stay cool but be able to get in and out of the boat easily. The trip was much more intensive than that, though. We started across the bay from Placencia, basically over open ocean in a big motorboat. I had to hold my hat on with one hand and hold my skirt down with the other to keep it from flapping up in the wind. I still managed to spot a few birds, helped by our guide who identified the ones he noticed as we passed. This included 2 magnificent frigate birds perched on a buoy, brown pelicans, and double-crested cormorants. We stopped at the mouth of the Monkey River at a village where we got out long enough to visit the bathroom and order our lunches for later. Then, for the next few hours, we were on the water with the boat puttering along through an open rainforest. The first bird we saw on the Monkey River was a great blue heron, a large, beautiful bird, but one that's very common at home. Everyone on the boat very helpfully pointed it out to me, even though I think I saw it before anyone, including our guide. Then we saw an osprey, although our guide didn't identify the species, and I didn't get a good enough look at it to do so myself. We heard some howler monkeys far in the distance, saw a small crocodile sunning itself among some vegetation, saw a bright orange male green iguana perched in a tree, and finally, my first life bird of the day. It was a bare-throated tiger heron, followed quickly by about 1 million white ibis, several little blue herons, a yellow-crowned night heron, and later, a ringed kingfisher and great kiskadee. Of those, only the little blue heron wasn't a lifer for me. We also saw 2 basilisk lizards, the kind that can run on water for short distances, a couple of black howler monkeys, and a lot of adorable proboscis bats sleeping nose to tail on a tree trunk leaning over the water. I also lost my hat, which blew off my head into the river. Since it wasn't actually my hat, but one I'd borrowed from Molly, I was relieved when our guide put the boat in reverse and maneuvered us close to the hat that I could snag it out of the water. I'm sure it wasn't the first time he had to rescue a tourist's hat. Also, I ended up wearing it even though it was wet, and it felt really good because it was a hot day. We returned at last to the village and our lunch, grilled fish and the delicious local rice made with coconut oil. I was worn out by then and glad to sit in the darkened room, electric fans blowing on us, and eat every bite of my lunch. After that, though, we got back in the boat, back into the bay, and spent another hour or so trying to spot manatees in the shallow water, without luck, unfortunately, but it was fun to look. The next day, I didn't even try to do any birding. I just relaxed on the beach and finally let my family talk me into trying the kayaks that were available for anyone to use. The water was placid and shallow, and I paddled around near shore, wobbly and cautious at first, then more boldly as I grew used to it. We saw little moon jellyfish in the water, just like the ones in Animal Crossing, some shadowy, fast-moving rays just visible on the bottom, and a crab. Molly, my brother, and I went to bed early that night because the next morning was our birding trip. We got up at 5 a.m. in order to meet our guide, Victor, at 5:30. That gave us just enough time to throw some clothes on, spray ourselves with bug repellent, and grab bottles of water. My brother didn't have binoculars and mostly just came along to make up the numbers. Ordinarily, we would need 4 people to schedule the trip, but they made an exception for us since we only had 3. Also, the resort was really not crowded. I think they were really needing the money. Victor was a soft-spoken, sturdy man with a harness for his binoculars so they didn't hang from his neck or swing around when he was trying to grab them one-handed. He drove us about half an hour away to the Coxcomb Basin Wildlife Sanctuary, then into the rainforest on a muddy dirt road. Victor was modest about his abilities as a birder, but the second he pulled the van to a stop in the road and we got out, he started identifying birds by ear, like immediately. Bam, bam, bam. He was so fast that at times I had a hard time keeping up with him as I scribbled the names of birds in my notebook. He would follow up by showing us the relevant bird on an app and play its call so we could compare it with what we were hearing in the trees. Sometimes we spotted the bird too, but more often we were birding by ear. I tried to keep track of the birds I actually saw or heard well enough to identify, as opposed to the birds Victor identified and told us about. I didn't want to claim a lifer that I didn't deserve. We definitely heard a gray hawk, followed by the sounds of brown jays mobbing it somewhere off the road. We heard a gray catbird, which is common at home, and both a gray-chested dove and a gray-headed dove. Their calls were very similar, but Victor explained the difference. The gray-chested dove has a drawn-out final note. We also heard a lot of wrens, including the long-billed nut wren, the white-breasted wood wren, a female hooded wren, a spot-breasted wren, and more. I can only claim the first two of those wrens as lifers, though. Victor also kindly identified one of the birds I'd seen a few days before, a very small bird, not much bigger than a kinglet or a goldcrest, with striking black plumage and white spots and streaks. Molly had taken a good picture of it on her phone, but even that hadn't helped me identify it. Victor took one look at the photo and said, "That's a white-crowned manakin." Sure enough, it was, and I wondered how I could have possibly missed that ID.
Suzy here, just stepping in to say, Kate misspoke in her recording, and she asked me to correct the species. Victor identified the bird as a Morelets seed eater. Back to Kate.
I especially liked that Victor didn't just bring our attention to the showier birds, like the keel-billed toucans and red-lored parrots. He identified all the birds, from the tiny olive-backed euphonia to the big green mealy parrots that we kept hearing just ahead of us, but which we couldn't spot for at least an hour. He was excited when we saw a yellow-faced grass-quit followed by a blue-black grass-quit, both of them sparrow-sized. We actually saw a pair of blue-black grass-quits, a male and female. The male is glossy like a tiny blackbird, but with a more compact build and a sparrow-like bill. We even saw a rufous-tailed hummingbird zipping through the undergrowth like a bee, and a masked tatira. The masked tatira is a striking bird, mostly grayish-white, with black wings, tail, and cap. Its beak is red, tipped with black, with a little hook at the end like a shrike's. In all, I can comfortably say that I added 25 birds to my life list in the couple of hours we spent in the wildlife refuge. But we weren't finished for the morning. Victor managed to turn the van around without getting it stuck in the mud, although it was touch and go there for a moment, and we headed back to the main road. We stopped first at a little shop where we could get locally made organic Mayan chocolate bars, small and rich and so meltingly soft that they had to stay in a rattling ancient refrigerated case. We hadn't had breakfast and were starving, so we bought way too much chocolate and then spent the next 10 minutes eating it while it melted gently against our fingers so that we had to lick them clean. Victor lived nearby and explained that he needed to stop by his house to get the lunch his wife had packed for him. We all nodded, sticky-faced and preoccupied with the best chocolate that any of us had ever eaten. It really was amazing, smooth and rich and very dark. After that, he drove us back toward the resort, but pulled off the road when we came to a stretch of coastal mudflats. It was full of low vegetation and shallow water, and probably crocodiles, but mostly it was full of birds. There was no shoulder to speak of, so we were mostly still in the road, with the flashers going, but it was still very early and there wasn't much traffic. From the side of the road, we saw a great blue heron, great egrets, a tricolored heron, little blue herons, short-billed dowitchers, black-necked stilts, blue-winged teals, which are ducks, long-billed dowitchers, red knots, lesser yellowlegs, white ibis, an anhinga, and wood stork flying over, and heard a clapper rail. We also saw a seed-eater poking around in the scrubby grass next to the road, but I didn't write down what kind it was. Of all these, I was certain of my IDs of everything but the red knots and the seed-eater. The birds were far enough away that we could have used a scope. Victor's binoculars were a whole lot better than ours, and he was able to see the birds well enough to differentiate them from the similar-looking short-billed dowitchers. Our final stop was only a few minutes away from the resort, and we didn't even need to get out of the van. Victor pulled up to a short public dock where a lot of birds were gathered and identified them for us as a double-crested cormorant, a willet, a royal tern, and some sandwich terns. Since I'm utterly hopeless at identifying gulls and terns, I was delighted to add 2 terns to my life list, along with the willet. And after all that, we arrived back at the villa in time for breakfast at the nearest restaurant. Belize is a beautiful country with an amazing variety of wildlife. If you get a chance to go, I really recommend it. The tourist industry is still relatively small compared to agriculture and other industries, but it's a significant help to the economy, and it's hurting right now. The official language of the country is English, although locals speak a variety of Creoles among themselves, and there are a lot of expat Canadians, Australians, and Brits living there. Our driver, who brought us to Placencia for our Monkey River trip, explained that that part of Belize is mostly rich foreigners' vacation homes, and he showed us Francis Ford Coppola's huge villa, where the driver also used to work. He said that rich people living in or visiting Belize was good in a way, since it generates good-paying jobs for locals, but it's also bad because it's driving up the cost of living. Away from Placencia and the coastal resorts, most people live very modestly. In all, I added 38 birds to my life list during the trip, which is just incredible. I returned home to cold and snow with the new year, but my bird feeders are busy with our lovely local winter residents, from bright red cardinals to handsome blue jays. I just wish I was still on the Caribbean Ocean right now with a piña colada and my binoculars.
Kate shared some recordings with me from the day out with Victor. And although I can't identify the birds, it's really exciting to hear all these unfamiliar sounds. Of course, you don't have to identify everything you see. Being on vacation, you may simply want to enjoy the sights and sounds of the bird life around you, drinking it all in and enjoying the moment. Being somewhere new that has a lot of unfamiliar bird species is really exciting. It seems like everywhere you look there's a brand new bird, but it can also feel a little daunting. You can avoid the overwhelm by treating each new bird you see as a puzzle to be solved, as Kate did. Use the key tools for identifying birds, noting their size, shape, colour patterns, habitat and behaviour. In addition, use your existing knowledge of similar-looking birds. For example, are they heron-like in behaviour, stalking prey in the shallows of swamps or rivers? Or do they hop on the ground like house sparrows or other seed-eating birds? Making a drawing of the field marks, the most distinctive features, such as blocks of colour or patterns in their plumage, or taking photographs, can also help when you refer to the field guides for the region later. Kate used these tools to identify the magnificent frigate birds. We'll just listen back again to how she described what she was seeing.
There was one bird I kept seeing along the coast, and which was driving me bananas because it was so distinctive, but I couldn't identify it. It was enormous, with long, sharp wings with a distinctive crook, and a long, thin, sharp tail. It was black or dark brown, but some I saw had a white bib. They would glide above the edge of the water so effortlessly, they seemed barely to move. I was positive I was looking at some kind of kite, but I just couldn't tell. It wasn't until I got a really good look at one's head and saw the distinctive slender hook-tipped bill that I finally identified it as a magnificent frigate bird.
As you can hear, Kate made multiple observations trying to narrow down the species. She noted their size, enormous, wing shape, long, sharp with a distinctive crook, colour, black or dark brown, but some had a white bib, and behaviour, effortlessly gliding above the water's edge. She likened it to a bird family she was familiar with, kites, but knew the species wasn't quite right. Finally, she saw the very distinctive, slender, hook-tipped bill, which helped her identify the species. Thanks so much to Kate for sharing this trip report. Kate shared with me the link to the resort where she stayed, and you'll find that in the episode notes. If you'd like to share a trip report with the show, whether from somewhere local to you or further afield, let me know using the contact page on my website, casualbirder.com. As always, the link is in the episode notes. If you'd like to help support this podcast production, you can add to the show's tip jar by buying me a virtual coffee at ko-fi.com. Tips will help to pay for transcription costs. My current goal is £200, which will buy 6 months of automated transcription and 10 completed episodes. We're now at 43% of the target, with thanks to the following for buying virtual coffees since the last episode. Audrey, from Hamburg in Germany, said, I stumbled upon your podcast last year and have really enjoyed working through the back catalogue. Thanks for creating such lovely work and continuing to inspire my own casual birding. Anna from Michigan said, love your podcast. It's both relaxing and inspiring. And Kathy from Florida said, I so enjoy listening to the Casual Birder podcast. I find it particularly relaxing as I'm driving to various places. Suzy has inspired me to slow down and really appreciate all the birds that I see throughout the day. Thank you all so much for your kind words about the show and for your contributions. If you're also able to help, you'll find the link to Ko-fi in the episode notes. But all of your support, financial or otherwise, is very much appreciated. My thanks to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by the Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. Check out their website at dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast.